Please, we must talk. This may be our last supper.
Well, uh, we're documenting the unfolding of a rather large and ambitious painting of something that's been on my mind to do for a couple of years. Uh, I've done this sort of thing in the past, in which I took a biblical narrative, which would typically be done in a more classical type of painting, as you might have seen during the High Renaissance. And I take these things and pick them apart and reconstruct them, and I try to intertwine with them more 20th century techniques and ideas. So the idea, the big concept here is, can you take a classical narrative and something that's known to be constructed, painted, and drawn out classically, and then interject with it a bunch of modern ideas, something that comes from maybe surrealism or abstract painting and so on. I guess the Italians would have called this the concetto, meaning the overall concept, which is different than the subject. The subject here, obviously, actually the subject would be complicated to me, because the subject being Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, which is painted, it was begun in like around 1495 and finished in the early 1500s. Yeah, I think he spent 7 or 8 years on it. Came back and forth to it. So it's a piece of work that's been known. It's obviously been copied before. I think it's the most copied painting in the history of art. It's the most viewed painting in the history of art. But these are things to me that are interesting, because when you take apart something like this, you inevitably see how powerful and how great this artist was, which is another piece of why I like to do this kind of thing. In the past, I've worked from Roger van der Weyden, I've worked from Hugo van der Goes, I've worked from Conrad Wheats, where I did the miraculous draft of fishes on a very large scale. Every so often I decide that, well, since I have painted from nature, since I've painted from life, and since I've explored all types of modern abstraction, I like to go way back and look at the sources of some of these ideas, and they're really quite remarkable. I got to hand it to Leonardo da Vinci. Certainly, he, without question to me, was a genius of how he composed things, and it becomes more apparent when you look carefully at his piece and you do a study and you start arranging the figures and you start looking at the space. I guess I'll talk a little bit about space, because that's the heart of this. That's where most of this comes from. A number of years back, I spent a lot of time at the home of Jackson Pollock, and I did a lot of reading and studying and listened to lectures on modern painting. And one of the overarching ideas was can painters, without making an external reference, meaning without painting a person or without painting a building or without painting a car or a house or so on, actually use internal subject matter? So what type of space are you going to create on the flat surface? Now, traditionally, this is a really beautiful painting, because this uses two-point perspective, which obviously, most people know that Leonardo was a pioneer and a genius at. You'll notice that by two-point perspective, they mean there's a vanishing point, and in this painting, by the way, which is twice as wide as it is tall, so that makes it very difficult, very difficult to compose. And the figures occupy like 1/4. The total distance here is about 1/4 the whole height of the picture, which makes it very difficult to compose a space. But what he did geniusly, which some of you people probably know, that these lines would actually extend into the room and follow the wall and ceiling in the actual room, which was done in the dining hall, and they converge on the face of the Christ figure, which is, he's just slightly off center too, which is very interesting. You can see I broke down this thing into quadrants, And interesting too, those people out there that study chakras and all that, the actual vanishing point is on the third eye, which I think is really interesting. I discovered this the other day. It's sort of like, we all know that the points, the lines would converge on the face of Christ, but they actually go right here, which, you know, one of those theories that Christ probably in his lost years visited India, spent some time meditating, probably studied Buddhism, that Leonardo da Vinci would figure, you know what, I'm going to put this picture together, I'm going to have this center, which would typically be the point of focus right here on his third eye. Very cool thing. When you're dealing with a rectangle this large, he, of course, and I'm just going to point out a couple of these things because they just unfold and become so apparent as you're working on this. It's really cool, really great to discover some of these things. Obviously, you know, those of us recall from art school the typical triangle. The triangle became very important because just like the Great Pyramids, the triangle is the most stable form. You got a triangle here, you got an inverted triangle here, you got another triangle here, and you start seeing how all these plates, they all sort of mirror the faces. There's an axis here. This is to make something as boring as a big panoramic rectangle, make it very lively, very rhythmic. And it's just absolutely fabulous. There's all kinds of cool things in here. How this dish completely mirrors the face. And what that does is liven up this space in here. We're given a perspective like we're looking down at this plate, and yet, like I mentioned, we're looking at his third eye, and then we're kind of looking up, and we're looking out on this wide. And as we look out, these people, figures, kind of occupy a shallow but very, very lively space. So, with that said, what had occurred to me, now if you were an abstract expressionist, you'd be looking at nature, you'd be looking at leaves maybe, you'd be looking at the waves on the sea. You would not be dealing with lines like this because it would go against the grain. The idea of a preconceived line, very antithetical to modern painters. You know, a typical abstract expressionist would, A, not use a preparatory sketch, would focus on the process and not the product, and would never pull out a ruler or a straight edge and make a bunch of preconceived lines, rather work from within where there's a lot of expressive power, a lot of movement, where the media, the paint itself, could just do anything. And if the paint splatters here or splatters there or drips or pours, or if there's a scrape or a rub, if it integrates compositionally, then you work with it, which is very different than this type of art. This type of painting, which is carefully composed first. An abstract painter would rather get the incidents and the happenings in the paint to go wherever they may, and then try to derive a composition from that. In other words, there's no preconceived idea. This is very preconceived, but what occurred to me is that he couldn't have thought all of this in advance. I figured that the overall idea of a giant rectangle that's twice as wide as it is tall, with a space down the center, you're going to arrange these figures. And they're broken up into little groups. There's a little group of 3 here. Again, almost happens in something of a triangle. This one coming around the table, so our eye can go behind the people and around the people and underneath the table. Haven't got to the feet yet. And in the real life, the real Last Supper, there was a hole cut here by a bunch of soldiers so they could make a doorway. But I did find an old etching that was done from the Last Supper before they cut a hole, so you can actually, the feet of Christ are drawn so it looks as if he's nailed to the cross already with the feet overlapped. So I want to put that in. You'll see the legs. So you have a kind of spatial arrangement where you're looking underneath. You have this perspective downward. We're looking downward at this table, and then we're looking upward here, which gives this entire thing a kind of a breath to it. So, my idea then is once this is all drawn in, and we just wanted to document the sketching process because I really wanted to fully understand this piece. I wasn't about to start doing any kind of indulgent thing with any sort of paint unless I really, really comprehended exactly what it was Leonardo da Vinci was trying to communicate to us outside of the story. I mean, formally there's like a head behind a head parallel to a head. This head, I presume, is in front of this head, but we don't really know that for sure other than the fact that the hands, they all interlock spatially. Again, it's really a genius thing to be able to take such a panoramic flat surface and give it this kind of spatial life, which I can't help but wonder which abstract painters could have actually created a space this lively. To me, this is, if anyone looked at, the work of de Kooning or Pollock, you'll know that during the 1950s in New York City, the big idea was, can we take abstract paintings and can they be as powerful and can they stand up to the classical period? And this was the argument that was had, because a lot of abstract painters felt, well, we don't even know if this is art, and certainly the public didn't respond well to it. Most critics hated it. But through their tireless and their art passion, so to speak, they came up with techniques and concepts which they felt stood up to. So in other words, if you look at Autumn Rhythm at the Met, you're supposed to ask yourself, when Pollock was throwing all this paint, when he rejected the easel, rejected the paint brushes, when he worked on the floor, and he went around all sides so there's no top or bottom or right or left to the piece, did he make a pictorial space that has as much cohesiveness and as much drama as this? Now, my whole idea is to take this, to realize it, to sketch it out, to really balance it out the way it would have been thought of classically, and then just interject some modern techniques like throwing paint, running, masking is a technique. I mean, I could go on about things that a surrealist might do. You could put your painting on the floor and you could cut up pieces of paper with paint on them and throw them, see where they go, so you get some spontaneous activity in here. And by doing so, create something that's completely divergent from the two-point perspective. But for now, we just wanted to get a sense. I mean, I'm using a really traditional approach to this, where I'm working with some ink, a little bit of chalk, a little bit of charcoal, and it's very tough. It's very meticulous. I did a quick study, and then you can see the proportions were worked out, and I have this architectural space which opens up as a sort of this here is like a target where you could take some purple or green, for instance, and hit it here, and it'll do something. It'll do something, and then you can actually work into the piece. You can with a drawing underneath, it's going to maintain the structure. So it's really quite an exciting experiment, something to try. So that pretty much in a nutshell is all I'm trying to do. I've been working on this for 2 days, so I'm a little struck by, the architecture, the anatomy. I think, what do we got here? 3, 6, there's 12, 13 figures. We've got Bartholomew, James the Major, Andrew, Judas, Peter, John, Christ, Thomas, James the Major, Philip, Matthew. Something struck me when I first did this study, and I realized how great a draftsman that Leonardo da Vinci was. He's got this arm, This occurred to me working today. when I was in art school, there was this thing called, people who work literally were thought of as like not as evolved. But you see, everything in this drawing that Leonardo puts, he puts there not simply to put a plate or not simply to put an arm. It all helps define the space. This arm stretches across. It kind of leads our eye to this guy's head, so we get a rhythmic move like this. We're directed like right almost toward the center of the piece. It's picked up from another arm. If you just, in other words, look at the arms and the hands in this, they create a trail so that you can read it like a hieroglyphic. And we have these arms which kind of direct us into the viewer. These arms on the side pull us toward the center. And these guys, the way they're leaning, kind of directs us toward the center, while these hands, they're kind of coming in here. If you're reading left to right, these hands, this is forward, this is back. These are level, actually perfectly level. They line up with this hand and then line up with this. It's just arranged so perfectly. It's stunning. So I've been sitting here picking away at it and discovering all these things, and we got Ray with his camera to come out here and help me take some notes so I can remember it before, once I start painting into this, all this will probably be gone. But the broad gestures are graphite. I like to work with graphite because it's very, it's soft, it's very dark, it's very velvety. And I use these, I think these pencils, they just came from Staples. It's a very soft lead, it's very black. But when you go into, it helps you to, you can stand back and you can get around. And then, as fortune would have it, they kind of blend with the water so that you can get it's very ink. You get a kind of this kind of thing helps you to create the dimension around these. And then you blacken an area. And if you really want to, or if you really need to, I use these, well, somewhere around here I got a white chalk pencil. These are kind of useful if you're doing an eyebrow or a nose or a lip. They all kind of help, hands, whatnot. And if you want, you've got this option. This is actually something you might see. This way you get middle range grays. All right. All I can say is, when you're working on one of these, all kinds of stuff pass through your mind. It's like a crash course in art history. And of course, with a camera on, you can't recall it all. But the immediacy. See, when I was in art school, there was this thing called immediacy. If you took a plastic bag full of paint and you threw it at a canvas, and the impact would send color. And if you could really work like that, and it's actually, that takes a certain type of control, but they would say, well, the immediacy in the paint. But Leonardo's immediacy occurs to me. He really, which I was told this back when I was at school, he picks a very isolated moment. If you look at a lot of Renaissance art, some of it's it's almost like time lapse, but this is very, very immediate. He's chosen, apparently Christ says, one of you will betray me. And you got this figure, of Judas, he's hiding a knife behind his back. And these people are all reacting, and they're like, who's it gonna be? So it's a very precise moment that's just been captured and arranged in this large panorama. I just find it very remarkable. So they're all going, huh, what, him, me? No, not me, who, you? And they're all sort of, discussing amongst themselves, like, who is it? And he's surprised and he's mournful. The level of expressiveness, I just find, it's just so incredible. Wish I could tell you more. I don't know the actual dimensions of the piece, but I know they spent I think 30 years restoring it because it's in terrible disrepair. The building itself was bombed during World War II, and they had sandbags up in front of the painting to save it, and the roof had been blown out by a bomb, and it's actually remarkable that the painting is still with us at all. And then it's been restored because Leonardo himself, he experimented by painting on apparently a damp stone wall, and he says in the book that I have, he put calcium carbonate on the stone, let it dry, and then he put some lead, let that dry, and then some typical gesso. But the three materials don't really react well to the wet stone. So even in his lifetime, the paint's been flaking off it. But because he was such a great draftsman, and because he hand mixed, I mean, in those days you didn't buy tubes of paint, you mixed it, you ground your pigments and did it yourself. He did it well enough where there's still enough traces, but we can only imagine like how brilliant this painting actually was in its day. But I'm taking I guess we're in the 21st century now. This is by the way, this is what is it, September 16th?
22.
Is it? No.
No, 17.
Yeah, 17th. Today's September 17th, 2018. So we're talking back, we're about, I know this painting was finished like in the first decade of the 1500s, so we're more than 500 years later. And people still flock to see this thing. It's been studied and picked apart, and here I am, doing my own little investigation of it, and I'm just happy to take the time and really acknowledge, this artist's work and everything that went into it, everything. You got your geometry, you got your expressive emotion that's in the figures. You've got such a dramatic interplay of spatial relationships. And as you draw like these plates on here, I mean, everything is so carefully arranged, as I mentioned earlier. You could probably say, well, there was a lot of halos in Renaissance art, and you notice there's no halos in here, but it's almost like these plates sort of function in that sense. But see what they also do, because you're looking down at this plate, and we're looking straight ahead, these lines would be called the vanishing point. The vanishing point right on his third eye, right? And he's at a slight enough angle to give it enough drama, but we're looking down at the plate and we're looking ahead at this and we're looking up at this. So on this totally flat panoramic canvas, we get this sense of breadth and space. And it's all picked up with every foreshortening is a big thing that Leonardo does, like the way these hands, we got some folded hands here, some hands like they're grasping something. This hand is out, this hand is open, this one, he's got two hands open, this guy's pointing, this one's holding a knife, this one's actually leaning on a table, he's got his weight down on the table. You see, I just sketched it in quickly, but see, again, this is a tactic that's frequently used by, it's not just a hand. This hand tells us the angle of the table. It tells us that we're looking down. It gives us a sense of gravity and weight of his shoulder. Even though it's just it seems like a bunch of poofy fabric, it's got weight because we see his hand, and his other hand is pressed down on the table because he's leaning in to hear what they're saying. This guy, contradicts that by like, huh? This other one, he's trying to tap on somebody's shoulder. Maybe he notices the knife and he's about to say something to him, but this is all like a split second that's been caught in the history of art and the history of the Bible. I don't think I have much more to say about it, but if you could just, I was hoping to document, I mean, this face I worked on a lot yesterday. And actually, I could say something, because this face One of the few drawings of Leonardo's that I saw in person that I studied very carefully is the study for the Madonna and Child, or the Virgin on the Rocks, which he did 2 paintings of. Apparently one's in the Louvre and one's in the National Gallery in London. But I saw the drawings for it. And it seems as if this face might have been a precursor to that painting, which I think is interesting too. So not only that, you're seeing faces that he uses in some of his other works. I've seen his sketchbooks from the Windsor Castle in London. It's like, I know, like this face I've seen in that sketchbook. Some of these, like, more, he kind of exaggerates their gnarly look. And I think he does it, like, I used to think, like, why does he make these gnarly looking people? Well, one reason is, like, if you look at this, the axis of this man's head, you know, the nose lines up with the beard, and then it lines up with the guy's arm that's next to him, and then it lands like right on this, I think it's piece of bread. It lines right up with this guy's elbow. So you're going elbow, arm, beard, nose, crown of the head. It creates a perfect rhythmic line, and it's slightly different than this rhythmic line. And I haven't done this yet, but perhaps something I should do is extend all of these rhythmic lines like Picasso might have done, and see where they intersect. You'd have one here that comes up. This line is almost perfectly in line with this architectural line. You can see that? This force here, it's all part of the composition. Everybody's sitting there as if they were being sucked into the vortex of his architectural lines. You know, the weight of this kind of, this is almost a big blackened panel that's in the hall. This, it just blew me away when I noticed, like, how this, you know, horizontal line of this Matthew's arm, it's parallel with the table. It's like one of the few, aside from the table, it's one of the few horizontal lines in here. It kind of picks up, you see how it lines up with the hand of Peter. Peter and Matthew's hands line up, which is also very interesting. Anyway, I could go on with that stuff forever, but pencil, graphite, water, a little bit of paint. I guess after this is worked on, we'll get some color into it. Try to have Ray come back with his camera, and we're going to make a comparison of how this thing, after Leonardo's drawing is firmly established, we'll see what we can pull out of it. It's going to be a lot of work, be a little perilous, a little risk-taking, but that's really all in the spirit of, you know, the 20th century painter. Can't just, I was told that it was Jean Cocteau who said in art that everything has to go farther than it's supposed to go. It's a remark. I was told this over 20 years ago, and that's how I look at it. It's like you can't just simply make a pleasing picture and just leave it. And there's an example of this. I mean, Matisse would paint all day, and then he would rub out his painting and get up the next day and paint the same painting and then rub it out and then get up the next day and paint it. And he would keep doing this because the more he worked on the same piece, the better at it he got. So by the time he got it to the 6th or 7th or 8th time, he was able to completely paint something with effortlessness. So really what he was after was a kind of effortlessness. And this is what I think they mean by you should always go farther. It's not really about just pleasing effects, but rather the whole approach to it. And incidentally, some of these heads I had to do like 3-4 times because you can't get them right away. You know, this one was way off proportionately. It was like the head was too small, or, you know, some of them the head's too fat, or it's too high, or it's too low. So you're constantly working over these till you can get it lined up. But anyway, everything should go farther than it should go. And this painting we're going to push it to, we're going to establish a limit, and then we're going to push it farther. And that's what I got to say.
We ordered a group portrait.
Ah. Yeah, Fernando, this is no good. All I got is a box. Okay. Everybody want to be in the picture? Get up and go to the other side of the table. Come on.